Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It is November 8th, 2017, and we are relentlessly tackling this issue of inappropriate interviews with Mormon leaders about matters of sexuality. We've been wanting to do this for a long time, but the impetus, I'm happy to say, is my former colleague from Houston, Sam Young, Bishop Sam Young, who's decided to start a petition to petition the Mormon Church to no longer allow 12-year-old girls or 12-year-old boys to sit alone with grown men and being, grilled about their masturbation habits or pornography use or sexuality because it's harmful and damaging. And so we're super grateful to Bishop Sam, for leading the charge on this. We want to encourage everybody to sign the petition. But we've already interviewed 4 different people about their stories, and we are now interviewing a 5th. These are going to just be stories about people's interviews with Mormon bishops, mission presidents, stake presidents on matters of sexuality. And it's our first couple to join us together. We have Maile and Ryan Waite, who are using their real full names, and they're using video. So that's really courageous and bold. So I want to welcome you both to Mormon Stories podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, the only courageous thing about it is that we don't look our best, and we're in an ugly basement right now. So
that makes it more courageous.
Yeah. So, but thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thank you so much.
We actually both, we both have left the church, and that's a story for another time. But there's definitely something objectively that we feel strongly about with the church that we feel, not from a doctrine standpoint, that would be better improved with the church, would be the interviews with bishops, with minors, and inappropriately talking about sexual intimacy. So we definitely appreciate your endeavor in capturing these stories and helping move this petition along.
I'm super honored. It's my pleasure, and it's only possible because people like you are willing to be courageous and talk about difficult things, right? This isn't easy stuff to talk about, right?
No.
Not at all.
You don't wake up saying, I want to talk about this stuff today on the internet in front of tens of thousands of people, right?
No.
You don't. Okay, why don't we start with you, Maile? Just talk about your background in the church up until the interviews. And then Ryan, we'll have you talk about your background in the church up until the interviews, and then we'll just kind of switch between you as you both kind of tell the story. Is that okay?
Yeah. So I was born and raised in the church. Very diligent, faithful member. I never had like a super strong testimony, but I followed everything to a T. Just the picture of like a perfect daughter. Never gave my parents any trouble. So anyway, my first interview was actually when I was 8, I think, alone was, when we had the baptism interview. But after that, I think it was yearly. And then when I was 12, every time I got a temple recommend or anything is when these one-on-one conversations started. But yeah, up until that point, nothing inappropriate happened. And so I won't say the story yet, but
okay. All right.
I was 17,
so devout, active, committed member of the church from a committed family.
Yeah. Right now I'm 23. Yeah. So okay. Yeah.
All right. How about you, Ryan? Just tell us a bit about your Mormon background.
Yeah, definitely devout Mormon until, so grew up very Mormon, went on a mission, went to Sydney, Australia, left in about almost a year out into the mission. From about 12 to 16, I was read my scriptures every day, wrote in my journal almost every day, practiced preach my gospel every day. And I'm not joking. You can ask my mom or brother about it. Yeah, so I was pretty devout, and then we met actually at BYU in an acting class, and we had to have the fun experience of still going to BYU, after we got married, but not in a temple, but not being non-Mormons. So that was a very interesting experience.
Say that again.
If anyone sees it.
So we both went to BYU. We got married, but we didn't get married in the temple. But then we still stayed at BYU.
Oh.
And that was
wow.
very, I don't know anybody else really that's experienced that.
I'm guessing that's going to be part of the story. Is that right?
No, it's not.
Not at all. I mean, that's another story for another time. But
okay. All right. Yeah. Well, you've got us intrigued, but we won't dig. Okay. So Ryan, very, very Orthodox committed in your background as well.
Yeah.
With the church. All right. So who wants to start telling their experiences with Mormon leaders in their interviews? What would be best for the narrative? You guys know the story best.
You probably, I think yours happened earlier. Mine didn't happen until I was 17. So let's start with your earliest experience.
Okay. So, and I hope, I hope all the viewers are open and not offended by genuine frankness. So I'm just going to say it how it was.
Lay it out there, brother. Yeah. Lay it out there.
So, I started masturbating at probably around 7 or 8 years old. I remember I got baptized, but I didn't really know it was bad. But then I started feeling bad about it. Remember, I told my dad, I was about 8 or 9. I was telling my dad, I was confessing already. So
you knew what that word meant at age 9.
I didn't know what that word meant, but I knew what I was doing was wrong.
Touching yourself down there is bad, kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So that stopped for a while. And then when I was about 10 or 11, it started up again. And I knew what the word was, at 10 or 11. So I talked to my dad about it. And I think after a while with my dad, he probably felt awkward knowing, from my baptismal age time when I confessed him, he told me, hey, this is something you should talk to your bishop about. And my dad's awesome, by the way, if anyone's listening. I mean, the best guy ever. But that's just kind of how you're brought up in the church, is thinking, this is something you should talk to the bishop about. So soon after that, I coincidentally had a bishop interview soon after that. And I told my bishop, and what was so uncomfortable or kind of weird about it was I was about 11, and I had to go into like pretty significant detail about it. And, it wasn't like a boys, I won't go into specific detail here, but it wasn't like the regular masturbation story. So it was pretty embarrassing for me to tell him in detail, what was happening. And, looking back, I'm upset kind of that the bishop was put in that situation to where a minor is telling him, explicit, sexual intimacies. So then,
can I just pause for a second? You make such a good point, because so far that's not been brought up. Almost the way that we talk about this is like these bishops are at fault, and to some extent they're complicit. But really, it's the system that sets this situation.
Yeah, no, it's
up.
totally the system. Totally the system. I even still respect my bishops. I really maybe that first one didn't. I don't know. Anyway, I should be careful what I'm saying, but I really like both of them. And it was actually after I was a minor when I had a lot of disagreements with bishops. But anyway, so when I was about 14, it started up again, and I was really, really felt guilty, because this was when I was in the heart of the most believing of Mormonism, and I felt awful, and I struggled. And when I was about 15, I had the yearly interview, and I, interviewed with my bishop. I told him what was going on, and so for about a year and a half, I kept meeting with him about once or twice a month, and I could not, no matter what I did, fasting, running, no matter what I couldn't get past like a week. And it's just, I don't know, I was a hormonal kid, I guess, growing up, but
normal.
And I guess probably the only honest young man telling the bishop.
Right.
And so at 16, what happened was, it was time for me to become a priest, and I wasn't able to become a priest. And the reason why was because of the whole masturbation thing. It actually had nothing to do with pornography. It was completely masturbation.
Oh my gosh.
And and I could not stop. And I told him, like how many times I had to do it or did it, and the count. And this is hard for me because most of the religious people, and the priests, they know your age and award. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And so they ask me, like, why are you not a priest? We all know you're 16. Why, and so, everyone in the ward knows what's going on pretty much. So 6 months after a priest, people began asking questions, but I never lied to the bishop. And finally, I remember I asked him what counted, as a masturbation. And he said, "What do you mean?" And because, I was kind of giving these logistics, but, sometimes it's not, in my mind, it wasn't so black and white. And I was like, well, sometimes, I'd start and then I'd feel guilty and I'd want to, I stopped, does that count? And then I remember we went into like details, like what counted. And basically we came to the conclusion that it only counted if you ejaculated. So
okay.
That was the conversations I was having in a closed door as a minor with my bishop. Yes.
That's where he drew the line. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and like I said, he's not a perverted weirdo.
No.
It was just,
how it is.
It's the system.
Yeah, it's the system. And it's the system for both of us. Me being a person where I like to be honest and as transparent, and I just want to move ahead and get past things. And so I never, like to bullshit or kind of, run around the corners or lie, whatever you want to call it. And so, yeah, so that happened. And then kind of had an awkward moment from that because I was in the priest quorum and they were all basically, you have the quorum before you break up into your priest, deacon, and teachers, settings. You kind of all meet together, right? And so we were meeting together and basically it's like they just publicly were like, "Ryan, why aren't you becoming a priest? Why aren't you becoming a priest? Do you just not want to become one?" And got really awkward. I remember I broke down crying and ran away from the church back to my home. And anyway, so that was probably in that moment.
Incredibly shaming, right?
Yeah, it was pretty bad. So there's that. And then after that, so that's my main complaint personally with this whole thing is the minors. After you're 18, you can do whatever the hell you want, whether you're the person going into the office or, it still has some vulnerabilities, and I feel bad for people, but that's my main complaint. But I will say though, that after I was 18, I had some really pretty bad experiences with sexual conversations with my bishops, specifically around masturbation. And I'll just say one, I know I'm blabbing on, but I had basically an investigation. I don't know if you want to call it. When I was trying to apply for a mission, or not apply, what's the word? Apply. I get my papers in for the mission, and the bishop's over it. And so I was being, I became an elder, and then when I went to apply for the mission, the bishop, this was in Colorado. This was a different bishop, and I told him that I masturbated, and he basically went to 3 of my previous bishops to talk about my transgressions and to get a timeline of how often I did it and to see if I lied before I became an elder. And then he came to the conclusion that I did. And then he delayed me 6 months to go on a mission. 6 months to go on a mission. Delayed me. When I was already on the line, I was trying to figure out my life. And I remember I broke down completely after that I was really upset because I was like, man, your son's probably doing it right now at your home as we're speaking.
as you're talking to me.
As you're talking to me. Don't think that I'm that one was really, really difficult. And
in some sense that's neat that you had enough self-efficacy to have that thought instead of just purely internalizing your shame. It's neat that at some point you're like, I'm probably not the only one.
No,
that's true.
No, and to be honest, I do remember one time in an interview with that second bishop where we were trying to figure out what counted. I remember he was saying that he's like, you're the most valiant of all the young men. You go to church, you're always preparing the sacrament 30 minutes early, you're reading scriptures, all this. He's like, and I'm pretty sure he said, I'm pretty sure you're probably the only one being honest about this subject. So it was, I don't know what to take from that, but yeah.
Yeah.
And then this isn't hearsay. I asked my sister this morning. This will be my final, comment on the story. I know I'm going on. I asked her if it was okay to share this story, and she said it was. I called her this morning, so I promise. And this isn't hearsay. I remembered I called her, and just to make sure it was true. That first bishop that I was talking about, he brought her in for her yearly interview when she was about 14. And in the middle of the interview, he told her, "Hi, he said, Kelly, I probably shouldn't have used her name. Oh, well,
you said
sorry.
you asked.
Yeah, that is.
So it's fine.
So anyway, she said, he says, I have, the Spirit is telling me that you have something to tell me. And so she's like, no. And he's like, no, the Spirit's telling me that you need to confess something. And she's like, no, there's nothing. And he said, have you had trouble with touching yourself? He said that on his own, with a closed door, with a minor girl, asking her to bring that up, saying it was the Spirit. And even if it was, and the system, it's just, that's something. And she said, no, she's not. And she was telling me, she's like, no, I didn't, she barely even knew what that term was at that age. And so that was pretty, I didn't know that till this morning, by the way. Apparently you and Allie did. And anyway.
Yeah. That's just, you want to think that that's just super rare and uncommon, but I'm hearing it from all over, right?
Yeah.
12, 13, 14-year-old girls with a 50-year-old man in a room with a closed door, asking them if they touch themselves.
Yep.
And then how do you touch yourself? Where do you touch yourself? How often do you touch yourself? How far do the fingers, just gross details, right?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry that is happening, and that's what this series is all about. So Ryan, just really quickly, what's it like adolescence is hard in and of itself. Like, take out all the stuff you've just told us. Adolescence is brutal. What was it like for you, always feeling intense shame and guilt that you believed came from God? What was that like for you as a developing adolescent?
I don't know. I suffer pretty badly from depression and anxiety, and I don't know, it's kind of chicken or the egg type thing. Did church influence it, or was it already there? I don't know, but I do know that definitely being in the church, growing up with that guilt, especially with that part, definitely enhanced the issues that I deal with. People I've noticed that tend to have a perfectionist attitude and take things not with a grain of salt, like I did growing up, tend to leave the church because they're vulnerable to that guilt and shame and overwhelming of that anxiety that they feel of constantly going this cycle. It's like for me with the masturbation, it was, oh my gosh, I hate myself. Why did I do that? Why am I so weak? Why am I the only one struggling with that? Oh my gosh, I need something to make me feel better. Oh my gosh, I'm going to push that as long as I can without doing it. And then finally everything just breaks down. You do it, and then it's a downward spiral. And it's a shame that I went through that with adolescent. And it definitely seeped down the road because, I left the mission early because I couldn't handle it emotionally and mentally, and, became rather suicidal, and essentially I don't think I realized it at the time, but didn't believe in the church. So I think, that's definitely stuff that translated over. But yeah, that guilt and shame was hard to carry every day, especially without the hindsight that I know now.
I'm so sorry. All right. Well, Maile, it's your turn.
Yeah. I actually am glad, well, not glad for everyone involved, but I'm glad you said that, that you've heard other people of this happening to them, because honestly, even though Ryan has had that perspective of oh, I can't be the only one, I feel like as a girl who is about to say what I'm about to say, I feel completely alone in that. So my shame has continued on, even though I have become self-aware and realized that it's ridiculous that I went to those interviews and spoke with a bishop. I still feel that something was wrong with me because it's not normal for girls to masturbate. So that's kind of like, I still am very embarrassed. I've never said this out loud. I don't like speaking about these things, but it's important that I do, because I already said it to an old man behind closed doors at an age where the only person I wanted to talk to was my mom, and I didn't even tell her these things because it's too personal. So, you know, that's my only experience. I didn't talk to my bishops growing up like Ryan did. I lied my way through every interview, felt very, very shamed because of that as well, because every time I went to the temple for baptisms for the dead, I felt that I wasn't supposed to be there because I wasn't worthy to be there. But I really, really did not want to confess that I was curious about my body at a young age. So, so I struggled with that guilt for about 5 years, from age 12 to 17. I lied. And then finally it became too much. I was like, I'm not going to be saved. My family is not going to be together forever if we're not all worthy. So I need to just do this. It's just a moment. So I plucked up the courage. I'm about as nervous now saying this on Facebook as I was back then, just because it's such an uncomfortable topic for me. But I, all through sacrament, I was just like, I've got to do this. I talked in my head to myself, just like giving myself a pep talk for about 3 hours. And then after church, I finally plucked up the courage to talk to my bishop. So I pulled him I pulled him aside and asked if I could talk to him for a little bit. And he, just disclaimer, was also a great man. I was really good friends with his daughter and felt very comfortable around him. But anyway, so I went into his office and I confessed that I had a problem with masturbation. Problem being that even though I don't think it's maybe normal, well, it's probably normal for girls to do it, but I don't feel that it's normal. But I only did it like maybe a few times a week, maybe, and never with pornography. But that was the first question my bishop asked me was, he got really red and uncomfortable about me bringing it up, but he's like, well, do you do it with pornography? And I said, no, I've never seen it. He said, well, what did he say next? He said, how often do you do it? So I told him like maybe a couple times a week. And then the next thing, he was silent for about a minute and was just kind of thinking through it. And I just felt such shame. And then he was like, well, maybe you can try taking a cold shower. That might help. And then I said, oh, okay. And he's like, and just try not to put yourself in that position. So if you're feeling tempted to do that, either go take a cold shower, or you can, just be around people instead of being in your room alone or wherever it is you do it. And so then he told me that I should probably hold off on taking sacrament for about a month until I could kind of prove to myself and to God that I could kind of stop myself from doing that. So for the next month or so, I didn't take sacrament. And
that's such a shaming thing, because everybody, you feel,
everyone
even if
knows.
they're not, it feels like everyone knows. And a lot of people do pay attention, and especially your own parents and family, right?
Oh yeah. And so what's
I mean, your dad's handing you
and you just
daughter,
pass
why
it.
aren't you taking this?
Exactly. So my parents were really understanding. I love my parents, great people. And so my mom would just kind of be like, Maile, is there anything you want to tell me? Like, you can always talk to me. But it was this unspoken rule in our family, and I guess in the church in general, that as long as you tell this old guy that happens to be in the boundaries of where you live, it's okay to not tell your parents and just tell him instead. And so that was kind of the unspoken thing. It's like, no, I'm not going to talk to you about it. Don't worry. I already am talking to the bishop about it. So, and that's how uncomfortable I was. I didn't want to tell my mom. And so it was a very uncomfortable process, but yeah, that's my only experience. And so I feel like sometimes I'm like, oh, well, other people had it way worse. But the fact that I had that conversation at all under the age of 18 is the part that frustrates me. My brother's 12, and the fact that he's probably having these conversations right now just like makes me infuriated.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's happening everywhere. Yeah. So is that kind of the story, or were there other things?
That was mostly
That's the I mean, we've heard accounts of other people, but we won't speak for them. But yeah, we've just noticed this trend as we've started talking to our friends. And so yeah, that's it. I'm sure there are worse stories, but those are our stories.
How
I think
go ahead. No,
I was going to
please.
say that we were speaking with her mom. Her mom's very, very into the church, and we were speaking with her mom, and I just remember saying that, it's a possibility that, you have family members that are minors that are, even your son that is discussing it. And I remember even from her perspective, she was like, that doesn't feel right. So, this is from an objective standpoint, even kind of like almost the BYU instance with the honor code, or having people, having to have the honor code know if you've been raped. You know what I mean? With that whole policy that had to be changed. And that was, if I'm
Just
remember
objectively.
right, objectively that needs to be changed. Yeah. So that's just something I hope that can be taken seriously by active members. And
Yeah. Real quick, what did these messages, are you guys comfortable sharing how these messages have affected you in adulthood? It's a sensitive thing, and sometimes there is no effect because people just heal and move on. But other times, these things impact us as adults and even as married adults. Is there anything in your cases that's worth sharing in that regard?
I mean, I also struggle from severe anxiety and depression. Just this perfectionist attitude of your entire eternal existence is affected by these decisions you make as a 12-year-old. Just that idea of like, you have to be perfect. And that's at least what I got from all of these conversations with my bishops was, you're really shamed if you happen to mess up. Not ostracized necessarily, but there's a sense of ostracism when you can't go on temple trips if you're not worthy, or those kinds of things that make you feel like it's all or nothing. You either need to be perfect or you're not saved. And so that has kind of carried over in just this perfectionist attitude that I have. I'm very hard on myself when I make mistakes. And that could just be other things as well. But I struggle a ton with that all or nothing thinking. So.
I think for me, it's finally probably the last couple of years, 2 to 3 years, I've been able to overcome that sense of guilt if something happens in that area. It just doesn't matter to me anymore. But it used to, even when I did not believe in the church, I would shame myself from habit. So that continued, but that doesn't continue anymore.
How did all this affect your relationship with the church? Was there a tie?
No, it's actually something that I didn't realize was pretty messed up until maybe even a year ago. That's the funny thing is, like, for me, I mean, I have a lot of gripes, with the church and its culture and its doctrine. But I didn't really think about it until I remember we were watching Spotlight. And
great movie, amazing movie.
It's really, really good.
Yeah, everyone should see that movie.
Yeah. And by the way, I'm not equivalent to that Spotlight. It's not,
but it could easily turn out that way.
But that's what I'm saying is it's rampant vulnerability where it's just, if you took your side. I remember when I was in there, I was like, man, that was the first time I looked at it and I was like, I've spoken about this personal element of my life, masturbation, to about 7 or 8 bishops. And 2 of them were from when I was between 10 or 11 to 18. Mm-hmm. And when I thought about that, and like I said, when Spotlight came out, that was when I started thinking of it. And that's when it affected me. But to be honest, that's just how part of the system it is. It didn't affect me growing up. The shame did, obviously.
And the shame eventually
led. But that has more to do with the doctrine than the actual interviews themselves. I guess they do make the decision they're making the decision based on that. But
I think it was every interview, not just the ones that had sexual matter discussed, because there was only that one. I've always had an issue with just this idea that this one man kind of holds power over the ward and over my life. I think it was the patriarchy that got to me mostly from those interviews. But the shame and just depression of walking into church and being there every Sunday is what eventually led me to leave. So just all of that guilt combined is why I left.
Got it. Yeah. Well, I know the church doesn't want to cause people to leave and stop believing. And in addition to all the ways that these practices are harming the actual members, it seems like the church is harming itself by treating its own members in ways that make them want to leave.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Totally agree, yeah.
Which makes these interviews a win-win. It's kind of like everybody benefits.
That's what I mean when I say that objective thing, just like the BYU instance with those rape scenarios where, they'd have to go to honor code, and it would make it so that they wouldn't want to talk to the police if something like that occurred. It's just, to me, it's a win-win. And almost, to be quite honest, John, I actually think this whole thing made it more of a problem, whatever you want to call it is, but in my memory, it was a problem than it would have been, right? Like if I wasn't going to the bishop, it wouldn't have been on my mind all the time. It wouldn't have been this pressing thing. So it's funny how I think it actually made it worse.
Yeah,
the actual act
with it.
of it. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think the church doesn't intend to create the illness that then it lifts itself up to be the cure of, right?
Yeah.
But part of the tragedy in all this is the church's own policies are what are exacerbating the problem the church claims to be wanting to solve.
Yeah. I think for me, a solution that I can see my parents and brother implementing, who are all active members of the church, is just having them present in those meetings. If they still find it important to have those interviews with the bishop, great. But I think that the parents need to be there. It just protects everyone involved. It makes it a more loving space where the bishop won't ask those questions in front of the parents. I can't see that happening. So I think that would be my suggestion to the church.
Yeah, I would just recommend the church have a strict policy, just like with other strict policies they've come under scrutiny with, like with primary and Sunday school, you can't have a single man. This should be the same way with the bishop. Bishops should not be allowed to discuss sexual activity with minors, period. Nothing judging. It's not some anti-Mormon rhetoric. It's just common sense. The door needs to be open, or a parent needs to be there. If not, then they can't do one-on-one interviews with a bishop alone and talk about sexual activity.
Absolutely. Let me read a couple comments from our listeners. Aubrey writes, "The system makes good men mimic predators." And that's true. It's sad, but it's true.
Yeah, mimic's a good way, because they're not predators, most of them,
Some are, but most aren't, right?
Most aren't,
yeah. Joyce says, "My dad was my bishop and he never asked me crazy questions." And I'll say, good for you, Joyce. I'm glad that was your experience. I'm sure that's a lot of people's experience, but it's also not a lot of people's experience. Susan writes, "It's not the Spirit of God that prompts conversations like some bishops instigate with young teens. Despicable." Charles writes, "The Stanford prison experiment comes to mind, how the uniform suits and the authority of these men makes them do and say things they would never do if they weren't bishop, stake president, or those in positions of power." And that's a great...
Very true.
On both sides, honestly. I mean, would I just randomly go in a room alone with a guy and tell him about myself as a minor? It's like, yeah.
Would any man ever walk up to a 12-year-old girl and ask her if she masturbates in any universe, right?
Yeah.
But yet somehow religion makes that okay.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah. And that's a protected right. so we can't argue. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah,
I'm
no,
kidding.
that's true. Yeah, that's when religion fights for non-discrimination, it's basically fighting for the right to do things like this, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Catherine is writing to you, Maile. Here for you, girl. You did nothing wrong. I can't imagine what you're going through, what you went through, what LDS Church does, how it makes girls, women, and boys, men feel is atrocious. Strong words from Catherine.
Thank you, Catherine.
Also offering support. Susan writes, shame, self-loathing, and fear are the consequences of these interviews. None of these are born of God. So what is the source exactly? That's a really good question. Melissa writes, do cold showers help anyone?
That's a really good question.
And my thought was, if anyone needs a cold shower, amazing. It's the bishop who needed the cold shower.
Seriously.
I know.
Yeah, good comment from Melissa. Aubrey writes, she's so right about thinking you don't have to talk to your parents and that the bishop is a suitable substitute. I'm not sure what Aubrey means by that, but
well, just that substitute of instead of me talking to my parents about
right.
Yeah,
kids should talk to their parents first, not the bishop first, right?
Yeah,
that's absolutely true. If your parents are safe, I guess, is the only exception to that. Joyce writes, where do the scriptures say that masturbation is a sin? I think there might be some Old Testament verses about spilling your seed or something to that effect. Honestly, that's how it's described.
That's crazy.
Yeah, in fact, in my interview with Tova, the former Orthodox Jew, she mentioned that as being part of Jewish law. And she referenced some sort of Old Testament scripture about spilling your seed. Jamie Hannes Handy, who we love, says, we set the rule they could only ask, do you keep the law of chastity, and only on a Temple Recommend interview. That's a really good suggestion. So just like adults are asked, do you obey the word of wisdom, and the adults get to interpret it, why not set the rule for youth and adults? Do you keep the law of chastity? And the youth get to answer it in however they want. And maybe they're only doing this in a Temple Recommend interview, not just in their day-to-day lives, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a great suggestion by Jamie Hannes Handy. All right. Well, guys, your story is so moving, so important, so courageous. Let me give each of you a chance to make some final points. We'll go with you, Ryan, first. Any final comments or points you want to make?
No, I think that's everything. I think I made all of them. Just okay. It's just something that needs to end. I think we're 2017, 2018 is probably time to take a look at that from take a step back and look at it, whether you're Mormon or not Mormon or anti or X or whatever the hell you are. It's something that needs to change.
All right. Well, Maile, you're going to get the last word then. Anything you want to add?
Great. I was just watching your TED Talk, that one about, being an ally to others and how you don't want to be on the wrong side of history. And I think this is definitely one of those moments where that's why I'm sharing this story. It's uncomfortable, but I'd rather be on the right side of history and help move change forward and be an ally for those that are still in the church, children who have no say in it. They need an ally.
They do. And thank you guys for being allies, and thanks to all our listeners for being allies. You guys gave a great story, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Carla writes, my uncle was my bishop, I think, and he was about 12 when he asked her if she masturbated. So that's another 12-year-old girl being asked by their uncle bishop if they masturbate. Jamie writes, just having parents in the room doesn't mean this problem goes away. And that's a really good point. Just having women in the room doesn't solve the problem. Yeah, and just having parents in the room, because sometimes Jamie says bishops will ask probing questions in front of parents. And also sometimes parents will be even more harsh and strict than the bishop. So Jamie makes a really good point that just having parents alone or women doesn't solve the problem.
That is a good point.
No, it doesn't solve the problem.
Bridger,
step forward.
Yeah, it can be. Bridger writes, Bridger goes even deeper, and she writes, I think it's a female, maybe it's a male, But let's look at some mail. Bridger writes, the whole worthiness concept is the problem. And that's actually going deeper. Tying someone's worthiness to sexuality at all is maybe even a more serious problem.
Definitely.
Well,
All
thank
right.
you.
Well, Ryan and Maile, we love you guys. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
You guys are awesome. I hope to meet you guys in person real soon.
Yeah,
that'd be
for sure.
great. That'd be great.
Awesome. Thanks,
all right.
John.
Have a good day.
And all our listeners, thank you for joining us. Thanks to all the comments and questions on Facebook Live. It makes these interviews more interesting, more interactive. Thanks to everyone who supports the Open Stories Foundation, who donates, who supports us. Please like us on Facebook, our podcast page. Please give us positive reviews on iTunes or on Facebook. Please let people know about this stuff. It all helps. And thanks to everyone who supports us, because it makes all this possible. Please donate to the Open Stories Foundation or Mormon Stories if you want to keep this stuff alive. All right, everybody, take care, and we're going to start up another couple more interviews before today's over. So just check right back on the Mormon Stories podcast page. We've got at least one or two more of these interviews to go. So thanks,
Perfect.
everybody. Take care, and we'll talk soon.
See you.
See you guys. So today we have a more brief interview we're going to have with Ryan Flake, and Ryan is going to talk to us about his experiences. Ryan, welcome to Mormon Stories podcast.
Thanks, John.
So why don't you just jump in, tell us a bit about your Mormon upbringing that would give us a tiny bit about your background before you talk about your actual experiences.
All right. Well, sixth generation member of the church, born and raised, spent most of my life in Arizona, baptized at 8, went on a mission at 19. It's about all that we have time for. But before I go on a little bit further, I did an interview with Natasha Helfer Parker on Mormon mental health, episodes 99 and 100, that I talk about more of my story. So y'all can go take a look at that.
Well, I'm sorry we have to rush you, but dinner is coming. So
Right.
I apologize. So why don't you jump in? Just give us an overview of your experience.
Okay. Well, I use humor to make myself feel a little bit better. So it's not that I'm taking these things lightly, but
Sure.
here's just to illustrate how naive I was growing up about sexual matters. I have a story. I went over to my friend's house. I saw a newspaper clipping. There was kind of a man and a woman. There was a nude photo from the back. You couldn't see anything, but I didn't understand the mechanics of sex. And so when I saw that the woman's left breast was going into a man's armpit, I thought that that's how sex happened. So I called that the boob pitting story. So that was when I was like 13. My first kind of interaction with pornography, or I guess exposure, was when I was 13. I was on the National Boy Scout Jamboree in 2001. And over the next 2 or 3 years, I had kind of minimal contact with it. And I can't remember during that period whether or not I had any bishops' interviews that broached the topics of masturbation or pornography. But I do remember one when I was 15. This was kind of in the heyday of all the pornography talks in the LDS Church. Mid 2000s, when every other conference talk was about porn. Well, my bishop got into the rhythm of asking nearly every youth right out of the gate, when was the last time you looked at pornography, and do you masturbate? / when was the last time you masturbated? So just right off the bat, they're assuming guilt and kind of feeding into that shame. So my bishop asks me if I had been masturbating, and I didn't know what that was. I didn't understand the mechanics of it. I mostly had seen still images of naked women and maybe a random video of a man and a woman having sex. And so I didn't understand that friction was friction. So I'm not too bright. So in that interview, he asks me if I had ever masturbated, and I said no, and he was a bit puzzled. And went on to explain how that kind of works. And he said that, it's when you pleasure yourself, it's when you make yourself feel good. And then he trotted out the For Strength of Youth pamphlet quote about arousing passions in your own body. And that kind of gave me the idea to try it. And so I already had enough guilt and shame over pornography as it was. And kind of him introducing me to something else that I did not get into by myself, that really, it really made me feel horrible because he was the one who told me about it. And so then I took that information and used it, and I knew it was a sin at that point. So I went from 0 to sinning a lot in my mind really, really fast. And for 2 or 3 years, I was pretty okay with compartmentalizing it. There was some depression during that time. But when I was about 17 or 18, I just cold turkey decided to try to give it up. And I was successful, mostly because I hadn't had too many bishops' interviews at that point that were asking those questions that I felt that I needed to really answer. So straight up, I lied for about 2 or 3 years just to kind of quell my own anxiety a bit. But then that all kind of changed when I got into the MTC. And this is where it started getting bad for me. I entered the MTC on January 31st of 2007. And a couple days later, the branch presidency, my MTC branch presidency, they had a meeting at the end of the class with, brother and sister missionaries together and said, oh, by the way, sins of masturbation need to be confessed, not just prayed about. And they said, we're going to stay here after class and anybody can come talk to us about it. I was a zone leader in the MTC, and so I, really took it upon myself to confess to it because I had done it 2 or 3 days prior for the first time in months. And just because of the stress of the MTC and whatnot, that was my coping mechanism. I just fell back on the old ways. And so I went in, and it was essentially pretty well surmised by everyone else who was in the building at that point, for those who were sticking around after hours, seemingly. So that really kind of gave me a complex and got that shame cycle in my mind that really just introduced depression later on in my mission. My first mission president, I served in South America. He was very good at being a facilitator for our experience. And when I came to him, I still remember the day, it was October 10th, 2007, I'll never forget it. I called him just in tears, asking, if I could talk to him. And I expressed what was going on and what I had done. And instead of being angry, instead of talking about sin, he said, we're going to refresh the page. Or in Spanish, refrescar la página. So that's what we did. He just said, don't worry about it. Just try not to think about it. And if it comes to you, here are maybe some skills to deal with it. And I really appreciated that. And that carried me for about a year.
So that's a good response, right?
Yes.
It's don't worry about it. Just do your best. And
yes. And it's one of the things I want to highlight is that
that's great. We need good stories.
Yeah. Most of my interactions with leadership have been positive. Some have not been. And but that first mission president was great. My second mission president, not so much. Instead, he had me recite scriptures 100 times in a row, and it was out of the goodness of his heart, I believe.
Literally? Are you joking?
Literally. No, literally. He would have me recite a certain scripture 100 times in a row to get the thought of masturbation out of my mind.
To yourself or to him? To yourself. Okay.
But we would have almost nightly calls. I would call him every other day for 3 or 4 weeks. And that represented a time commitment on his end. I understand that. But it was just too much of a focus on it. And I have anxiety as it is. So that just really kicked it into gear.
Yeah.
It ended up making me kind of act out, not sexually, but missionarily. I started doing more and more risky things as a missionary to try to prove to God that I was worthy enough for him to just take my sexual feeling away. And so like I would stop semi trucks on the highway and give the bewildered drivers a copy of the Book of Mormon. I would like preach Dan Jones style in dangerous slums. And
so it was reckless behavior because your kind of anxiety and even depression was so high, you weren't acting in a way that valued your life.
Absolutely. I believed in magic. So I wanted God to just magic all of my feelings away. And I ended up seeing a mission psychologist about it. And it really hurt me because there were rumors in the mission that, you know, I was going home early and all that. I didn't end up going home early. I ended up finishing up my mission and, you know, mostly focusing on building homes and I tried not to be a jerk. But yeah, that really kind of changed my perception, and it became a secret thing for me. It became the only secret I ever had. And in my exit interview with that same mission president, I brought up to him that I thought that I would never be able to love a woman the right way because I had looked at pornography, because I had masturbated several times. And, you know, he didn't do hardly anything to refute that. And that killed me. That really made me unspirited, I guess. And so I came up with a goal to get married like as soon as possible after my mission. And we set goals to date within 3 weeks and whatever, which I hit. And I ended up getting married within 10 months of getting home. And I remained married. Great marriage. It's wonderful. We've had our ups and downs. But that's something that, you know, I just wanted to get married at all costs, mostly because of my interactions with my leadership and them telling me that essentially I needed to, otherwise I would, you know, turn into a 20-something that's not married, you know, the trope. So I get home from my mission and I go to BYU, and here's a good interaction, semi-good interaction number 2. I had a stake president interview me to be an elders quorum president. And at the time I was not looking at pornography, but I was masturbating probably once or twice a month, maybe once. And when I, you know, just in tears again, just feeling like I just had to continuously just bring up this awful thing about me. He looks at me and he's like, "Well, do you look at porn?" It's like, "No, I have in the past, but I don't anymore." And he's like, "Okay." Like, I got the feeling that they had so many problems finding returned missionaries to be elders quorum presidents that weren't masturbating and looking at porn. So I guess I was the lesser of evils. So yeah. And then, you know, married life, I got married a couple months later. How are we on time?
No, go ahead and kind of finish the crucial parts of the story.
Crucial parts. So skip ahead a couple years, and I confessed to my bishop about looking at porn and masturbating about once a month. That's about my threshold, or it was at that time. And so he doesn't really ask me any questions. He just asks for my temple recommend and tells me to go to the addiction recovery program. So that's the Natasha interview that it really focuses on that. And
so that 12-step program where you call yourself an addict and you talk about yourself in terms of sobriety.
Yeah. And it was, I had a lot of high hopes at the beginning, even though I was really unsure about it. But I hoped, because I was doing the program, I was trying to go to the temple once a week, living in Northern Virginia at the time, just running myself ragged, trying to do everything I needed to do. And after about 6 weeks of it, I realized that it can't help me, because there's no mentorship. There's no real help other than reading Packer quotes about, you know, studying the gospel versus human behavior, and just the same stuff that you would get in it. Essentially, it's preach my gospel, just watered down a little bit and written in the third person. That's what the addiction recovery manual is, in my view. And so I started making plans to castrate myself, or to find some sort of pill or doctor or whatever. Luckily, I was, not very wealthy at the time, and I did not really have access to do that. And my wife knew really very little. She knew I was going to the program. She knew I was there, but she did not know my internal struggles. And so at that point, I started making plans to do that to myself, because I just didn't want to feel it anymore. I did not want to be a sexual being. I wanted to be, in my mind, I wanted to be a robot. I just wanted to just kind of live life that way and not have any feeling. Luckily, I found Mormon Stories podcast in December of 2012, and everything changed after that. I found community. I found Natasha and Jennifer Finlayson-Fife, sex therapists that know what's going on and know the difference between addiction and somebody just using something to cope, and different modalities there. So essentially, that was my story up until about January 2013. I did not have many interactions with bishops after that. I realized that by disclosing that information, they had power over me. And I also realized that it's none of their business. So I started talking to people on the internet, Mormon Stories podcast community and whatnot, and just hearing the stories that we've heard today. And just hearing people around in the Phoenix area, bishops, stake presidents that I knew that mean well, but they are not trained. They, like has been said in other interviews today, they pick up on old ideas that are kind of just word of mouth. They're not in any manual. They're just kind of inheriting what the bishop before them did. And I know many of them asking those questions were very uncomfortable. At this point, I work with LGBTQ youth as my side job, and I'm more trained than any bishop there is, other than those who are, licensed clinical psychologists or social workers or whatnot. And that scares me because I feel like I don't know very much. And so I don't know if the last question that you told me to answer was what I think the church could do to fix this. Number one, stop asking those questions. Number two, allow people to have other people in the interviews, parents, guardians, somebody, like has been said earlier today, that the interviewee chooses. Also, the vocabulary around that. It's not worthiness interviews. It's faithfulness. And then the third thing would be for us, if those things don't change the culture. Some people might get mad at this, but we might try to go a little Mike Norton and start giving recording devices to young kids. If that's what's got to happen for it to change, that's what's got to happen. And I know we can talk about well-meaning people, 6 ways to Sunday, but at the end of the day, this is wrong. It is damaging. It is not promoting health. It is promoting secrecy. It's promoting shame cycle. And it's also taking power away from parents. There is no reason at all why sexual education should happen in the bishop's office. Zero. I know we're prude as Mormons. My sex talk was, not very long. It included don't look at porn and keep it in your pants till marriage. So I did not have the tools. We need to tell parents there needs to be something in the church that says, hey, comprehensive sex education is a thing. Even if you want to do abstinence only, at least that's something. It's more than a lot of my friends got. So yeah, that's basically it.
Hearing you say that you thought about castrating yourself, can you talk about that just really briefly? Like, that almost sounds too extreme to believe, and yet I've heard that before. Mm-hmm. And if anyone will remember the book, The Backslider, Levi Peterson actually writes about that sort of thing. So is that something you can just talk about really quickly?
Yeah, because luckily I don't have much to tell about it. It was about a month or two of planning and internet searches, writing letters that I never sent to my wife about why I would want to do that, trying to figure out how to tell her that we would not have any more biological children. There was a lot of Mormon things that I was going to give up by getting rid of this part of myself. It was hard. And
but what was your logic in doing that? You already said it, but I just want you to say it one more time.
my logic in wanting to do that was so that I never had to worry about that ever again.
Yeah.
So, like, again, I might not understand the mechanics of everything, and I know that testes do more than just that, and there might be some sort of ghost effect. I don't know, but that was as a 25-year-old person, that was my logic and reasoning. And because I don't have medical training, or I didn't at the time, any medical training at all, no sex ed training whatsoever, other than very rudimentary, where things go. Luckily, I was able to get that through listening to podcasts and researching a little bit. I wish I had had that information sooner. Then I wouldn't have ever planned to do that. And yeah, you said that I'm not the only one you've heard that from. Yeah, there are dozens of us, dozens, John. More than that, there are many people who have thought about doing this, and it's completely unnecessary. Masturbation is normal. It is something that we do. We are human beings. We evolved this way, and we need to stop beating that part of us down with a stick.
Absolutely. Well, Ryan Flake, it's really courageous for you to share that story with us. It's kind of jarring. I actually didn't know that was part of your story, and I just really appreciate you being willing to share your story, because it's the only way things get better. So
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Maybe we'll have you back to tell more of that story, but for now, you've been a really important part of this series. So I just want to thank you so much, Ryan Flake.
Thank you.
All right. Please stay in touch, will you?
Will do.
All right, everyone. We're running out of time. I've got one more interview. It'll be our 8th for the day. I've got one more interview for this story, so please stay tuned. And thanks to everyone for joining us for this epic 7 or 8 part series on inappropriate interviews with Mormon bishops around sexuality. Thanks for the support, everybody, and we'll see you again in just a few minutes. Take care. Thanks again, Ryan.